Welcome back. We did promise you that Bayo will be joining us, or we will be joining Bayo because he's been on standby like from 10 minutes to 11 till now. Bayo, good morning and welcome to the run-up.
Good morning, Yamgul, and good morning, Jay. Good morning to the viewers as well.
Sometimes it feels really weird saying good morning and welcome to you from somewhere else because we're used to having you around here and then saying good morning together. But we do hope that you had a wonderful weekend, though.
I did, thank you, and I hope you had a nice one as well.
And you have taken your breakfast because we are hearing so much about food insecurity. I hope it has not started.
For now, I'm still food secure.
Okay.
Okay, that was a good one.
That was a very good one. Okay, now, well, the United Nations and the international community seems to be worried about the situation we have at hand, or maybe not the situation we have at hand, but according to their projections, we are going to be very food insecure in the nearest possible time. What's your reaction to that?
I think this projection is actually fairly accurate. The only thing is, I honestly don't think that we need the United Nations to tell us that. I mean, at the top of the program, even Uche gave a very good analysis. We've had flooding. We have most of our food baskets ravaged by either banditry or some terrorists or attacks or some form of insecurity in terms of physical security now. So it's just a matter of time. If those scenarios do not abate or are not mitigated, it will definitely impact on the available food supply that we have for our population. So what I think is that the UN is doing its job, but frankly, we have enough experts in Nigeria to be able to give us the perspective as to what could happen. But I think the relevance actually of the UN here will probably have to do with what we see in the international environment. So while we have local reasons why Nigeria could become food insecure, we also have a dimension which is coming from beyond our borders. As you know, we import some of our food as well. We don't produce everything that we need, even though we have the capability to do that. We have just not addressed it and done what we're supposed to be doing. One of the major threats to food security for many countries in the last 9 months has been the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And interestingly, the UN itself, said that almost the whole of Africa was going to be seriously devastated if the war didn't come to an end, because we all depend on either the Ukrainians or the Russians for our food supply. Now, this is, I think, not entirely correct, because if you look at all the statistics, it's maybe just 3 major African countries that depend entirely on both Russia and Ukraine. This is Egypt, Madagascar, and Eritrea. And between the 3 of them, for example, Egypt buys 70% of its wheat from those 2 countries. Madagascar buys 80% of its wheat from them, and Eritrea is entirely dependent on both countries, that is Russia and Ukraine, for 100% of its wheat. Okay? Meanwhile, and this is interesting, they never talk about how the conflict in Ukraine and Russia is affecting Europe, because it is actually affecting Europe more than it is affecting the rest of us in terms of food supply as well. Ukraine alone provides 52% of the maize that Europe consumes, provides 23% of the vegetables that Western Europe consumes, and provides 72% of rapeseed and sunflower that Western Europe consumes, including the United Kingdom. And then 1/4 of the entire poultry meat that is consumed in Western Europe. So when you look at the statistics, you find out that Western Europe is actually more threatened. But why the whole information is spun round to give the impression that Africa will starve if the conflict between Russia and Ukraine does not end is actually really surprising. Now, of course, the conflict is bad. People are being killed. There's devastation, and everything has to be done to bring it to an end. But if only like 11 countries in Africa out of 54 African countries depend on both Russia and Ukraine for their wheat, mainly wheat supplies, I don't think that translates into the whole of Africa being threatened. So that's the perspective I wanted to bring. I must mention, though, that Somalia is in a very critical stage because, as you know, Somalia has for many, many years or decades been devastated by conflict and also by climate issues to the extent that Somalia is practically unable to feed itself. And humanitarian agencies have to import food to supply, to make sure that Somalis have food, and largely also they import wheat, that should go around. So this is a very, very critical situation. But most of Africa is not that dependent on the system. And like I said, in the case of Nigeria, we've had really devastating floods this year. Uche said that at the top. I should give credit to Uche. We've had flooding, we have insecurity, physical insecurity in our food basket, the Middle Belt and parts of the North. And if we don't do something, to mitigate the security challenges and to make sure that we do not suffer this amount of flooding next year, then I think we will have food insecurity.
All right. I read the UN reports that, that we are basing this conversation off of, and I couldn't get a grasp of why they would make such a statement, having the knowledge that you just shared with us right now. Do you think there are other, reasons why they came up with this report? Because if you look at a country like Nigeria, before the flood happened, I know we do a lot of importation, but we also produce most of the food that we eat. So goes for Ghana and most other countries in West Africa that I am sure of. But do you think there are other reasons why the United Nations had, things they had looked at and, they based this report off of it?
Oh, definitely. I think normally the UN, is an aggregation of states. So every state which is independent and recognized is a member of the United Nations. And the UN has a responsibility to its members, to play its role. It has a lot of experts and expertise, and it always tries to put this, at the disposal of its member states. Now, Nigeria is of course a member state of the UN. And then I believe strongly that the UN is essentially reading, but for me, we know what will happen. For me, it's not that the UN is saying it. All I said at the beginning was we don't need the UN to tell us. We have several experts in the country. We have agricultural faculties or faculties of agriculture and agronomy of most of our universities. They are on top of this. We have the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, headquartered here in Nigeria. We have various research agencies. They do all these things. They track all these things. But then the UN, when the UN lends its voice to it, I believe that the authorities take the UN more seriously. So this could be one of the reasons why the UN is coming out loudly. And also, I think it's a wake-up call coming from the UN to ensure that they strengthen the position, even in the ministries of agriculture of the states and of the federal government. We have people there who probably would have also brought all of this to the attention of the government. So when the UN speaks, it adds a very strong weight to whatever positions those are taken. Don't forget that if you take, for instance, the climate issues like flooding and so on, the Nigerian Meteorological Agency always provides timely and reasonably accurate prediction of the weather scenarios. but we don't take them seriously. You know, people this year they almost perfectly predicted the flooding, the timing, and the states where all of this have happened. You know, but we just ignore those things. It's like in Nigeria, it's only when an international organization speaks that then people take it seriously.
But what does this say about international or external influence on our problems, so to speak? Because, like I said in the opening, when after Uche said something about the flooding and all that, I also talked about security. That they said that about this time we should have been like 5 countries or 6 countries because Nigeria was going to split. That was their prediction, and we didn't split. So what does it say about this kind of fear-mongering, if you permit me, from the international community to our problems in Nigeria and the kind of agenda that they want to push? Because certainly, like you explained, the parameters they used are not exactly or entirely accurate. They know this, like Uche pointed out. They know this, that we do not depend on these nations, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, as much as they do. But they're playing down on their own dependency and talking about our own. So what does it say about the international community in our affairs?
Well, I think in the international system, don't forget that states have their own national interests, which they try to advance. And when a state advances its own national interest, it necessarily does so against the national interest of another state. Okay, but when both of them now come to an agreement, you know, that's you reconcile those differences. That's what happens all the time in the international system. Continuous reconciling of differences. Unfortunately, when in situations where you cannot reconcile those differences, you may end up having a conflict like we have in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. Now, if you look at the projections sometimes that come, you have states and then you have international organizations. So if we focus on states, because the analysis that supposedly claimed that Nigeria will cease to exist, this was something attributed to the Central Intelligence Agency. I think it was a CIA book or something, which they publish annually. And they had listed certain trends and concluded, based on those trends, that Nigeria might cease to exist. But then let's not forget that from what we have seen, even in recent memory, some of these international some of these countries and their agencies often terribly get it wrong. I give you 3 quick examples. Look at Libya. They moved into Libya, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in particular, okay, fueled what happened in Libya against Colonel Gaddafi. And they say, okay, if we remove Gaddafi, Libya will be stable, there will be democracy. Look at Libya today. Libya is factionalized. And to the extent that an northern part of Libya is reasonably under the influence of General Khalifa Haftar, okay? And General Khalifa Haftar was a general under Colonel Gaddafi. And then the same international system that said we will remove Gaddafi and Libya will be stable, now went to same General Khalifa, who was a Gaddafi general, to come and stabilize Libya, right? If you look at Syria, if you look at Iraq, if you look at Afghanistan, you will see that if they were that correct in their analysis and projections, these countries will be stable today. So that just says that they don't always get it right, you know, and to that extent, I believe that nationals of different countries have a better understanding of their own country and are in a better position to provide analysis that can be useful for advancing their countries and for ensuring stability. What often comes into play are the local factors, which every country has. And I think the challenge is for the authorities in these countries to take their own local experts seriously and to heed whatever advice and suggestions are coming from them.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to bring this down to, you know, the schools of thought. Usually when things like this happen, people come up and try to make it look like there's a conspiracy theory. around these things. I'm asking this question, stemming up from what Nyamgu said about how these international bodies and countries in the West seem to be very interested in the things that happen in Africa, ignoring how it is directly affecting them personally. When the COVID-19 happened, we know that there was a lot of conspiracy theories around it. And it has continued because if you look at it, it doesn't really make sense, actually. And then these people, are right now saying that there's going to be food insecurity, citing it from the perspective of how it is going to grossly affect Africa. You talked about Libya. When Muammar Gaddafi died, people said it was also a conspiracy theory to stay in control of Africa and Africans, even while we claim to have achieved democracy and independence. Do you believe there is a place for these theories in these situations?
Well, okay, I might not say, I understand completely the question, and I think it's a very good question. But I will be careful not to say conspiracy theory. That doesn't mean it's not a good description. It depends on whatever perspective one is advancing the argument from. But what is very clear in the international system is that every state, every country has an interest. Every country has an interest, and every country will advance that interest. And in the process of advancing that interest, they will do everything possible to make sure that they get, to the desired end of advancing that interest. Sometimes, including by destabilizing other countries. I know if you recall some months ago, there was a drone. This was widely reported, so it's nothing secret. It was widely reported. There was an advanced drone that entered Nigerian airspace. And this drone was tracked by the Nigerian Air Force that dispatched an aircraft called the JF-17, which is the latest advanced fighter aircraft in the Nigerian Air Force. And the JF-17 chased the drone, immediately left our airspace. Now, the question you would ask is, before we acquired the JF-17, was it possible that these people have been coming into our airspace, at will? And to do what? And the allegations, if that drone came from Niger Republic, and if you do an analysis, we know there are only two likely countries that could have flown that drone from Niger Republic. So, and now these same two countries are countries that are supposedly on friendly terms with Nigeria. So I'm just using this example to show you that on the one hand, you see, states will be advancing their own interest and say they are friends with you. But on the other hand, if they feel that your interests will collide with theirs, they might do other things to undermine you. So this is why you must have the capability to protect and to defend yourself. But having said that, I feel strongly that it's, especially given the challenges in the international system today, it's in the interest of states to come together rather than to provoke acrimony and tensions. And Africa has become a new, if you like, there's a new scramble for Africa, because we have raw materials in abundance. And you can see the competition between the Euro-Atlantic powers and China over resources in Africa. And now some have said that this is probably what is even playing out in Ukraine, because Ukraine is one of the few countries in Europe where you still have vast forests, massive arable agricultural land, which you do not have in most countries of Western Europe. And so it will be in the interest of Western Europe for Ukraine to be on their side, okay? Whereas, and Ukraine has its own legitimate interest as well, including its own legitimate security interest. And it is also, it's also a fact that Russia also has its own interests and its own legitimate security interest. So what should simply happen is for these two countries to reconcile their differences, and let us have, because they are too critical for the international system, for these wars to continue. Just as Africa is too critical for the international system in terms of the availability of raw materials, almost at a level that we can describe as ad infinitum. So that puts us in the crosshairs of the major powers, who will want to have access to our raw materials? And we need to understand that. And then in the process of doing that, there may be friction here and there and from time to time between them, which will affect us.
Okay, well, no matter what it is, whether it is true or false, the projections that are coming, food is very important, and this is not a time to do the usual not my portion that Nigerians like to do. We have to sit up and see what we can do to make sure. But now, we'll just take a break, Bayo, and the next, when we return, we'll bring the next guest who will be talking on the place of political debates, especially presidential debates in national election, but would like you to stand by and listen to him so that we'll get your comment at the end of that. So when we return from the break, Professor Chris Nwokobia will be joining us to talk on the place of presidential debates in national elections. Stay with us.